Through the years, Marcy and I have been telling a lot of stories about why we wrote songs, why we learned songs, some of the people that we learned them from, the adventures that we've gone on with learning some of these things, the people that we've met traveling all over the world. It's a pretty crazy thing. And finally, we decided to put together this one story that melds together various different parts of that, or of our two lives. And it's called Remembering Elizabeth Cotten, or How Cathy Met Marcy. We're going to start off with Elizabeth Cotten's most favorite song that we want you to sing with us. Freight train, run so fast. Freight train, run so fast. Please don't tell what train I'm on, or you'll know what route I've gone. When I'm left-handed, but she played a right-handed guitar upside down and backwards. Now think about it, that is the folk music equivalent of Ginger Rogers doing everything that Fred Astaire did backwards in high heels, and add to that upside down. Our stories interweave with hers. And I holed up at the end of the house, closed the door in the den, and 3-4 hours a day, page by page, I would go through the guitar styles of Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I would learn all the things right out of tablature in there, and I'd learn all of their songs. Their songs became my songs. Their finger-picking patterns became my finger-picking patterns, and I just played all of the time. Well, a bunch of years later, I ended up going to McGill University, and part of it was for the purpose of actually going to college, but part of it was because I had heard that Montreal still had an active coffee house scene in the early 1970s, and I was really intrigued by that. And then, for the next 2 months, I went to the open mic, and I sang the same 3 extremely important Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell songs every single Sunday.
Well, my corner of the world was different than Cathy's or Elizabeth's. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. My great-grandmother was a fiddler, and she was quite a wild woman. For many reasons she was called a wild woman. Back in the day, she would drive a car by herself. I know, if that's not enough to ruin a young woman's reputation. Then my grandmother started to grow up, and she took up the piano, and she played Barrel House Blues and Honky Tonk and Boogie Woogie and the hits of her day, and she was amazing on the piano. I just couldn't believe watching her when I was a little kid. Her fingers would just dance up and down the keyboard so fast they were a blur. She was faster than that big blonde woman on the Lawrence Welk show. It was unbelievable. Well, my grandmother and my grandfather, she married a man who played the tuba in the Salvation Army band. So they were really looking up. And they had a bunch of kids. One of them was my mother. And she had a little jazzy trio that worked around Detroit with 2 of her sisters. But I also had another aunt who lived across the street from us, and she played acoustic guitar, and she only sang for the Lord. If a song didn't mention Jesus, she would have nothing to do with it. But they didn't have to be happy songs like the rest of the family liked to play. They were things like, I've been washed in the blood of the Lamb. Now, to a little kid, that's spookier than Halloween. Well, then in the 1970s, the late 1970s, I started an all-girl string band with 3 of my scruffy hippie friends. We were in our early 20s, and we were playing old-time music with a vengeance. We were hired to play in bars. The name of the band was the Bosom Buddies, because we thought it was funny. We went off to do this wonderful-sounding gig at a bar in northern Michigan called the Booby Hatch. We thought it was hilarious. The bosom buddies at the Booby Hatch. We had to go up there just to get our pictures taken. What could go wrong? When our fiddler turns to me and she yells, "Grab a speaker and run!" So we grabbed as much sound equipment as we could and grabbed our instruments and ran for the car, and she bravely went back in and got all the cords, just wrapped them all up in a mess and threw them on top of us, and we drove away. A few days later, we got a call from the Toronto Folk Festival. It was international. It was in Canada. We'd hit the big time. And then the performer's packet came in the mail. And that's a packet, it's a big envelope with a folder, and you open it up, tells you who's going to be there and where you're supposed to be and what time and all those things, and when all your workshops are. So we look down and we see at the top of the list, Elizabeth Cotten. I was amazed that she was still alive. So we got to this festival. The time went by, we got to the festival, and there were lots of people milling about. There were 6 large stages, and behind the largest stage, we walked with our instruments, and there was Elizabeth Cotten sitting in a chair with her guitar, looking so sweet, even sweeter than she looked on the record cover. And she was holding her guitar, and she was looking down at it, and I could see the fingerboard wear. Now, this guitar was made by the C.F. Martin Company. It was a 0018 from the 1950s. It had mahogany sides and back, and it had a natural spruce top. And I was mesmerized. I had been wanting to meet her, and I just looked at her, and I took a deep breath, and then took another deep breath, and I was too afraid to say hello.
Now, in 1980, I flew up to Toronto to make my first solo appearance at a folk festival. It was the Toronto Folk Festival. This festival was an artistic success, but a business disaster. It went bankrupt before the last song was even sung. There's an ongoing joke that one of the few good things that happened from the Toronto Folk Festival of 1980 is the meeting of Cathy Fink and Marcy Marxer. And we were all playing and having a great time, and it was probably about 3 o'clock in the morning when we realized that the person whose room we were in might be ready to fall asleep. And they eventually kind of kicked us out. Well, Marcy and I thought, we're not quite done. We still have some tunes in us. And this hotel's under construction, so let's go down the hall. We'll find an area that they couldn't possibly be putting anybody up, and we'll just play a few more tunes before we crash. So we go down the hallway, we find this area where the wallpaper is half off, the plaster's peeling, the rug is kind of shredded, there's dust, there's dirt. No respectful hotel would ever put artists or other people in one of these rooms. We just felt like we were safe, and we just started playing and kept on playing, and after a while we were on to Little Rabbit, Where's Your Mammy?
A good time. We're playing, we're sweaty, we're sitting on the dirty floor playing instruments, and we heard a creak and a door opened. Out stepped an elderly black lady in a cotton floral housecoat with a hair wrap and slippers. It was Elizabeth Cotten. She was 87 years old. She looked at us, we looked at her. We felt like sinking into the threads of the carpeting. She gave us a look of resignation and frustration. And she said, I prayed to the Lord to make you children a little less happy.
A few hours later, I was in the Toronto airport with all the people who were flying home. And they called my plane. I was pretty exhausted too. And I looked at my ticket, walked down the aisle of my plane, got to my row, and saw that in the aisle of my row was Elizabeth Cotten. I said, "Excuse me," and I sat in my seat, and she kind of gave me a little hairy eyeball. And I was so exhausted that I just immediately fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but when I woke up, I noticed that they had delivered the meal trays. Anybody here old enough to remember when airlines gave you meals? Or some reasonable facsimile. And I looked to the right, and the person there had eaten most of it. And I looked over to the left, and Elizabeth had eaten most of her food. And then I looked down at my plate. And while I was sleeping, Elizabeth Cotten had rearranged my food on my plate into a happy face. And I looked at her, and she gave me a little smile, and I smiled back at her, and I realized we were okay. I saw Elizabeth Cotten perform one more time. It was her 90th birthday. And the Smithsonian Institution was having a big birthday celebration at the Baird Auditorium. It was jam-packed, 500 people, and on the stage were no less than 50 of her relatives. Her daughter, her grandchildren, her cousins, her nieces, her nephews, you name it, they were there. And the very last person that she invited on the stage, her last relative, her last family member, was Mike Seeger, because the two of them had become family for each other. And it was a very beautiful celebration.
Elizabeth passed away in June 1987 at the age of 92. Mike Seeger summed her up in one word: grace. And it's true, when you were in a room with Elizabeth Cotten, when you were listening to her play and sing, you knew you were in rare air. You knew you were in the presence of royalty. And that little songs like Freight Train are really huge songs that are going to be sung for years and years to come.
And as for us, all these years later, 36 years later, we are still playing at hotel construction sites, libraries, parks and recreation, and concert halls all around the world. And we want to close with a song that Alice Gerard wrote. Alice, when she was married to Mike Seeger, did a lot of touring with Elizabeth Cotten. And Elizabeth used to say to her, "When I die, I don't want to be buried in a grave somewhere. What I want is I want to be laid out with a silvery gown and some wildflowers in my hair, and I want to float down the river while everybody waves goodbye." And Alice wrote this beautiful song called The Sweet South Anna River. On sweet South Anna River, where the leafy waters flow, she whiled away her childhood days in the sweet long ago. Her voice echoes down the river through the distant shores of time. Remember me, I was a queen. You're gonna miss me when I'm gone. And let the river carry me on, past the redbud and the pine. And won't you sing to me As I take my leave, you're gonna miss me all the time. That's your part. Let the river carry me on, past the redbud and the pine. And let the river carry me on, past the redbud and the Thank you.
Bring, 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 bring.